Now let's discuss how do we buy a property. We mainly use these 4 creative strategies to buy any investment property. In this training, you will learn how to purchase an investment property using creative strategies. We also take the automated lease purchase ALP system investing as being the nothing down investment strategy. Many people who begin with us in real estate investing believe that they need a lot of money and they get withdrawn because of that. The difference between the ALP lease option system or no money down investing system or any other creative investing system is that with the ALP system, you really don't need money to start with. ALP lease option investing system, all you need is motivation and perseverance. The irony is that many people are put off by drive and determination because they require a great deal of motivation to succeed. To make things happen, you must have the desire to go out and meet people and talk to people and make things happen. There are basically 4 ways to acquire lease option properties, as we have previously mentioned. Number 1, obtaining them from a motivated seller is our first option. Number 2, obtaining them from a motivated investor is our second option. These are motivated investors who have dealt with difficult tenants in the past. I want an investor who purchases property solely to put them into my ALP system. He's adamant about not being in charge. He's driven by the desire to earning money. This investor makes pre-construction purchases. He gets about 20 to 30K profit from these pre-construction deals, and he gives them to me. He's adamant about not getting involved into the management of the property. Number 3, through motivated tenants is our third method. These are people who own their homes but cannot keep up with the monthly obligations. They are now being forced to sell these properties. They might have good enough equity in the property, but because they don't have good enough credit, or they are in other kind of situation, like they don't have good enough job, they might be forced to sell the property but they don't want to sell these properties because they have their children going to school nearby, or they've been in that neighborhood for long and they're attached to that. So they sell the property to one of our investors and then rent it back as a part of lease option agreement till they get back on their feet. Number 4 is a regular investor can be used as our fourth way. We have motivated tenant buyers who have been unsuccessful in obtaining a mortgage. We enlist the help of an investor to purchase these properties on behalf of these tenant buyers. The first 3 options are where the property is already in existence. The final option is that where we're buying a new property or we are taking it under purchase lease option. The final lease option means is the tenant first lease option. So in the sections below, we'll go all over these 4 methods. In the following section, we'll go over each of the 4 methods of purchasing lease option properties in great depth. Lease option from a motivated seller. So how to get under the ALP system a lease option property from a motivated seller? The simplest and most straightforward way to obtain a lease option property is to find a motivated seller. We discussed some of the reasons why a seller might be motivated in our previous section. Perhaps they were laid off or had to leave town, they have a mortgage payment to make on another property, or they can't afford to make an additional payment for this house where they don't live in. They're incredibly driven. Locating motivated sellers can be accomplished in a variety of ways. You will often see motivated seller written on the ad, whether it's for sale by the owner or on the MLS listing. I use a simple trick to figure out if a motivated seller by looking at for sale by owner ads on their classified sites. If the property is listed both for the rent and for sale, you know the seller is eager to sell. Regardless of the circumstance, the person is attempting to sell the property or get rid of the property either way. To obtain this property, you should make a direct contact with the owners. You can find the sellers, take the assistance of your assistants, or have someone to call them. You can have your assistant call them to pre-qualify. You need only to ask these motivated sellers one simple question. Would you keep your mortgage if I could take over your property today and start covering all of your monthly payments? If they say yes, you know that you got a motivated seller on your hands. So this means that you have two options from the seller's property. Number one, you can either get them to lease option the property to you, so where they're leasing the property to you, which is the method that we'll cover in more detail, which is like a no money down technique that we have. You can also get them to transfer the title to you, which is known as the seller financing. And keep in mind that most mortgage documents contain a clause which is called due on sale clause. Some argue that it's illegal for someone to transfer the title while still being the mortgage holder because of this clause. That's not the case. It's perfectly legal to share the title. It's not illegal, but the clause states that the current mortgage of the property is due on sale if you transfer the title. On the other hand, the lender is unlikely to bother you as long as you keep making the payments. They might be curious or concerned about why the payments are now coming from a different person. But as long as the mortgage is paid, and it's usually not an issue. I have done several of these transfers. They have always gone smoothly. I inform the bank that I'm the property manager for the current owner and the payments will be made from this account. I usually have the property management agreement in place in those situations. In conclusion, the best way to get a property from a motivated seller is to lease it and then transfer the title from the owner. Transferring title is a legal transaction that will need to be handled by your lawyer. There are also fees associated with this transaction, but you can negotiate with the owner to have those fees paid for you. So you won't have to pay anything. So that's the straightforward method for locating motivated sellers. When you ask a seller if they want to transfer the title in your name and they say no, you know that they are not that interested. Then you just move on to the next potential customer. As previously stated, there are several methods for locating the motivated sellers. Another option is to speak with real estate agents. Realtors aren't necessarily motivated to help you unless you can find a way to compensate them or pay them. Typically, you can pay them with the funds from the tenant buyer's deposit. Before you take control of a property purchased from a motivated seller, make sure you have a contract in place that you have 30 or 60 days, whatever the number of the days that you have to market the property. So there you have it, how to buy the lease option property from the motivated seller. Lease option from a motivated investor. So here in this technique we will discuss how to get a lease option property from a motivated investor. This is, believe it or not, the simplest way of obtaining a lease option property. First and foremost, an investor is already motivated to become an investor because they are the one. It's just that they haven't made a profit as a landlord. We previously discussed why a motivated lease option owner is already an investor. It's because they are not excellent investors to begin with. They had a string of bad luck with the tenants and weren't exceptionally skilled at property management. They didn't know how to qualify their tenants properly, and as a result, the property was destroyed or was damaged, or they had problem with the tenants. So they are an investor who wants to keep on investing, but they are changing the strategy lightly. They are transiting from hands-on to more very hands-off investor. So this is something that a number of my investors are interested in and they are doing. And believe me when I say that once you find one of these investors and they have an extensive portfolio of properties, it's a beautiful thing. One of these investors, one of my investors sold me 5 properties and I bought them all. Some investors will go further along in their investment careers than others. Perhaps they have been investor for 20 years, are simply tired of it, and they would like to stop. However, rather than selling the property and cashing in, they are aware of the lease options and consider it as a good alternative. You will use the same contracts for the investor as for the motivated seller. With a regular seller, you have the same deal as you do with an investor. Again, you begin by assessing the property's worth. What's the amount they owe? A knowledgeable investor will have more information than a regular seller. They may not be as eager to relinquish the property in exchange for the money owed to them. They could be looking for a little bit more cash. You need to look in the market to see if the price they are asking fits into your strategy and if you're able to sell the property for that amount. Because they are more experienced, more investors would prefer not to hand over the title or do seller's financing. They might be able to work on a lease option with the investor instead. The property would be sublet to a tenant buyer. In the end, the investor's motivation is the most critical factor. They will be motivated and eager to hand over the keys to you if they had a string of bad luck with the tenants. I was in a hurry to complete these transactions when I first started doing over them years ago. Any deal I made with the parties who were not motivated turned out to be bad deals. The underlying principle is that you always have to look out for motivation, authentic inspiration, not just, well, I thought about it and maybe I'll do it, but, well, I thought about it and I will do it. You don't want to enter into a transaction with the people if that's the case, because they haven't made up their mind yet. As a result, the investor would either transfer the title or the lease option to you. After that, you will negotiate a lease option with the tenant buyer, and the spread is where you make the money. Let's say you're paying $1,200 per month to purchase a property for $300,000, and you're charging the tenant buyer $1,600 a month with the option to buy at $345. The deal you struck with the investor was very similar to the value you had with the motivated seller. It's just a different situation is that they are already investors and you don't have to teach them how to be investors. Because a consistent seller may need to sell to buy another property, the investors will be more likely to willing enter into this type of transactions rather than a regular seller. Lease option from a motivated tenant. How to get the lease option from the motivated tenant. I'll talk about getting a lease option property from a future tenant. You can call it also a lease buyback is the other name for it. And with the lease buyback, we are looking for homeowners struggling to make their ends meet. Mortgage guys will say, listen, I've got Bill here. He's having some financial difficulty. He has racked up significant amount of debt, including some large number of credit cards. He has second mortgage on the house and desperately needs assistance to pay off his debts. Are you able to offer help? By the time I get the call, the monthly debt payments, which were $1,800, have been increased to nearly $2,800. And this person is unable to keep up with the payment. So he goes to the mortgage broker to refinance. Unfortunately, the mortgage broker is powerless to help because there's insufficient equity in the house or the client's credit has been severely damaged, preventing him from refinancing. If the situation is that bad, he may lose the house as he has already missed so many payments. So Such a client can be highly motivated seller as well. By purchasing the property from the current owner, paying off all of his debts with the proceeds from the sale, and renting the parcel or the property back to him in a lease option arrangement, and the lease buyback provides the relief to the current owner. In this situation, we can bring in an investor to buy the property from the current owner and then lease it back to the current owner under the lease option agreement. A lease buyback is similar to finding a tenant buyer, bringing in an investor, going out looking for the property, and then leasing the property to him. The only difference is that we already know what the property is, so it's a property first in a sense. However, we also have a tenant, and all we have to do in this case is find an investor. So in this situation, we first locate the investor, after which we purchase the property from the current owner, who then becomes the tenant buyer, and we enters into a lease option agreement with the investor or us. We complete all of the standard contract. When doing the lease buyback, you can use a few tricks. First, make sure there's enough equity in the property to pay off all of the debt, and that the owner is currently carrying, means paying the monthly payments and stuff. And the monthly payments are reduced to a more manageable level. This makes it easy for him to pay us on a regular basis. You also want to make sure that there's enough equity left, which can be held as a down payment for the future buyback. So, for example, let's say the property is worth $350,000. And this seller owes $250,000 on his mortgage. But perhaps the price is lower than $350,000 because we want to keep some equity in the property for the future when the owner repurchases from us. This is another technique. Let's say we bought the property for $330,000, leaving us with $30,000 in equity to use as the down payment for the eventual buyback purchase in 3 years, and the immediate walk-in equity of $20,000 as part of our profit. So we are paying $330,000 and keeping $30,000 for the option fee payment, and paying off $50,000 in the bad debt that he owes, the credit card debt or any other debt. The owner does not receive any from the sale of his house, but he does get all of his debt paid off and the opportunity to stay in the same house, keeping his children in the same school while paying a lower monthly payment. Not a bad situation for the owner. We set up the lease option agreement for however long he wants to. We think it is necessary. Normally it's 2 to 3 years. We'll have an agreement price for this to buy back the property in the future, which could be anywhere from, let's say, $350,000 to $370,000 or even $380,000, whatever we think is necessary to make us a reasonable profit in that transaction. And just like any other lease option. Lease option from a joint venture, using a JV investor to purchase a lease option. Another option is to use the JV investor to purchase the lease option property under the ALP system. We would use a JV investor to acquire a lease option property in a couple of situations. The first is when we have a new tenant buyer and need a property. As you may recall, this is the tenant first strategy. We bring in the investor in only after we have exhausted all other options and can find a property from a motivated seller. The other situation is in which we use a JV investor is that for a tenant-owned property in which the tenant owner becomes the tenant and which is known as the lease buyback arrangement. Getting properties from motivated seller is very similar to getting properties from JV partners or JV investors, except that JV investor is about to become the seller. But the big difference is that we have to purchase the property, which means more work is upfront and other costs that this investor will incur. For example, if we are purchasing a property for $300,000 and the investor requires a 20% down and pay 2% of the closing costs, the investor would be required to invest $66,000. I need to collaborate with these investors to ensure that their deals have a reasonable rate of return for them. The investor can make money in a variety of ways, as we will explain later. In the ALP lease option investment, money is made through monthly cash flow, principal pay down, the sales price minus the purchase price, which is the profit, by manipulating various profit areas to provide a reasonable rate of return to the investor. We must ensure the investor's profit is protected and also it's fair to the tenant buyer, and the tenant buyer is also benefiting. I also guarantee the rent payment for both joint JV partners or JV investors and motivated sellers, so that if the tenant buyer doesn't pay me, I'll still pay the owners. Covering the rent reduces the seller's risk and helps to persuade them to do the deal. Remember that some of the sellers are about to become investors, but they have no intentions of doing so. On the other hand, if a joint venture investor becomes an investor, it is because they have made a conscious choice to do so. The investors I work with prefer to be hands-off. They don't want to be involved in the property management in any way. They don't want to deal with the tenants in any way. They don't want to deal with the unpaid rent. As previously stated, I guarantee investors rent for the project's duration, typically 3 years, as most of these lease option programs are. The other thing I do is that all the tenant issues such as evictions, if these are causing any problems, these investors don't want to be involved in any of these activities. In summary, we use the JV or the joint venture investors to acquire the lease option properties. Still, we use them as the last resort when we have to buy the property from an existing homeowner or a lease buyback, or when we need to buy a home from the tenant when he didn't like any of the units we already had.